This story. Hook, you please listen. This story one time. Then you want to listen this story again and again. What's the one thing that tests a woman's boundaries the most? I paused, thinking. Time, maybe. The years had settled on me gently. I learned it wasn't about age, but about how you lived. Relationships? No, not that either. I'd been married to Ray for 10 years. We were solid, in sync, no big problems. But there were always things. The kind you couldn't quite name, the kind you refused to acknowledge. And lately, something nameless had been stirring inside me. Tate. Ray's son from his first marriage. From the start, the word step had always felt too sharp, too distant. I hadn't raised him, but he'd been in my life for years. Now, at 23, he was successful, charismatic, and handsome, yet reserved, always holding something back. And that distance, that invisible wall he kept between us, unsettled me more than I cared to admit. There was always one step between us, like he was waiting. But for what, even he didn't seem to know. And that was the danger. That's why I'd always made sure we were never alone for too long. When Ray announced he couldn't make the Chicago business trip, the air shifted. "You two go ahead without me," he said casually over breakfast. My heart stumbled. "What?" "It's important you take Tate," Ray insisted. "He'll learn a lot from you." Tate's eyes flicked up, briefly meeting mine, and in that instant, something passed between us. Something I'd been trying to avoid. We were going to be very alone. Later that evening, as Tate and I went over plans for the trip, the conversation shifted. It wasn't just business. The way he listened, the way his eyes lingered on me, it felt different. And every time our gazes met, a familiar weight settled in my stomach. Wasn't it Ray who was supposed to keep the lines clear? This time, I knew I'd have to do it myself. But deep down, I wasn't sure I could. At the airport, the tension was palpable. We sat side by side, making small talk, but the silence between words felt heavy. On the plane, he turned to me, his voice dropping into something softer. "You're different when my dad's around," he said quietly. My throat went dry. "What do you mean?" Tate shrugged, a slow, knowing smile playing at his lips. "Like you're avoiding something, by..." The time we reached Chicago, the sun had set, and my nerves were frayed. At check-in, the receptionist handed over 2 key cards. "Your family suite is ready, Miss C." "Family suite?" I turned, confused. I'd assumed we'd have separate rooms, but now there was only one suite with 2 beds. Tate stepped closer, his voice calm. "It's fine," he said. But the knot in my stomach tightened. In the room, the atmosphere was charged. Chicago's city lights spilled across the room, casting everything in a quiet, intimate glow. When Tate suggested a drink, at the hotel bar, I agreed. Anything to push away the unease. The bar was stylish and dim, the soft jazz wrapping around us. A few drinks in, I felt lighter, more at ease. We laughed, and the conversation grew deeper. His eyes stayed on me longer than they should have. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself this was nothing. But when I finally stood to leave, his voice stopped me. "Good night, Sai," he said softly. But his eyes, they asked for something more. Back in the room, the silence was too loud. My thoughts were a mess, my body tense with something I didn't want to name. And then I saw the jacuzzi, the conversation, the closeness, the way my body had reacted to him. What had just happened? I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Was this normal? Or was it just the alcohol? But I couldn't lie to myself. This feeling hadn't just appeared out of nowhere tonight. Maybe the hot water would help clear my head. But part of me already knew. There were. For the first time, I had simply let myself feel it. After stepping out of the jacuzzi, I slipped on a robe and walked toward my bed. But something stopped me. Tate. He was sprawled across his bed, slightly drunk and fast asleep. His shirt hung open, his pants slightly undone. A warmth spread through me. He looked so damn good, so unguarded, so exposed. And it completely wrecked me. I held my breath and quickly turned away to change, but even that wasn't easy. The sound of his steady, deep breathing filled the room, a quiet comfort I hadn't expected. And when I lifted my head again, my eyes landed on him, and the truth hit me. He was insanely attractive. How much longer could I keep denying this? One thing was certain. I was standing on a very dangerous line. You should change. His voice, still rough with sleep, broke the silence. I froze. He blinked awake, his eyes finding mine. And then he smiled. He shouldn't have, but he did. And when his broad, defined chest stayed on full display, I knew I was looking too long. But I didn't look away. Not fast enough. Tate's smile softened, his eyes locking onto mine. And in that moment, I knew tonight was just the beginning. The next morning, the room still carried the weight of the tension from the night before, though we both pretended nothing had happened. Dressed in sharp, elegant outfits, we prepared for the day ahead. As Chicago's golden morning light spilled through the windows, I watched him button his shirt, composed, confident, mature. So handsome, so dangerous. I held my breath, grabbed my bag, and forced a smile. "Shall we go?" I asked. Tate swung his jacket over his shoulder, his eyes meeting mine. "I'm ready." And I was ready too, though I wasn't sure what for. By the end of the meeting, I felt an odd sense of relief. I'd wanted to see how Tate adapted in a professional setting, but he didn't need to do much. Just by the way he carried himself, people trusted him. "How was it for you?" I asked as we left the building. He tilted his head thoughtfully. I mostly just watched and listened, but it was definitely useful. I smiled. "You didn't say a word today. You just stood beside me like my assistant. But one day when you go into your own meetings, if you don't let your shyness get in the way, there's nothing you can't handle." I paused, my voice softening. "I'm telling you this as a 48-year-old woman who's been through hundreds of meetings. You can trust me." He looked at me for a moment, his expression serious. "I do trust you." And the way he said it, so genuine, so steady, left me breathless. To break the tension, I tapped his shoulder lightly. "Come on, let's grab a coffee." At a small cafe near the hotel, we settled in. Tate stirred his coffee, his brow furrowed in thought. "So," I asked, keeping my tone casual, "what about your personal life?" He looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" I shrugged. "How are things with women?" For a moment, he said nothing. Then a small, knowing smirk curved his lips. "Honestly, there's not much to tell." I didn't believe him. Women watched him everywhere. At the bar, on the street, even now. He didn't seem aware of it, but the attention was undeniable. And for some ridiculous reason, the realization bothered me more than it should have. I set my coffee cup down, a little too sharply. "Let's head back to the hotel," I said briskly. Tate looked surprised but didn't question it. As we climbed the hotel stairs, my frustration still simmered just beneath the surface. I didn't dare examine why. Maybe that's why I didn't notice my footing. Just before stepping into the elevator, my heel slipped. A sharp pain shot through my ankle. "Ah," I stumbled. But before I could fall, Tate's hands caught me. His arm wrapped around my waist, steadying me. I was breathless, and too close. Are you okay?" His voice was soft, filled with concern. I looked up, my eyes meeting his, and something inside me ignited. "I think I twisted it," I whispered. Without hesitation, Tate slid his arm more securely around my back, guiding me into the elevator. The space felt too tight. My ankle throbbed with pain, but the only thing I could focus on was his warmth, his strength, and the way my hand gripped his shoulder just a little too tightly. The touch wasn't an obligation. It felt natural. When the elevator reached our floor, I tried to walk, but barely managed 2 steps before another sharp wave of pain shot through my ankle. I stumbled, and before I could fall, Tate's arms were around me. "Are you seriously carrying me?" I asked, wide-eyed. He smirked. "You're not really giving me a choice here." His voice held that familiar, teasing tone that always made my stomach flip. He adjusted his grip, securing me against his chest, and as I rested against him, I felt everything. The warmth of his body, the strength in his hold, his breath near my skin. We weren't supposed to be this close. And yet, I couldn't pull away. When we reached the room, Tate carefully laid me down on the bed. He adjusted my legs, but the hem of my skirt had ridden up slightly, folding awkwardly. I should have fixed it, but I didn't, because my eyes were on Tate, and his eyes stayed on me a moment too long. He exhaled softly, shook his head, and pulled back. "I'll get some ice." He turned toward the mini fridge while I stayed there, lost in thoughts I shouldn't be having, feelings I shouldn't be feeling. When he came back holding the ice pack, his face was serious. He knelt in front of me, carefully taking my ankle in his hands. The cold pressed against my skin, and I sucked in a sharp breath. "I should have told you before," he said softly. I lifted my gaze. "Told me what?" He looked at me, deep, intense. "You can't run from this, Kai." He swallowed. "We can't." A slow heat spread through my veins. This was dangerous, but it felt too right. "Tate," I began, but his hand lifted to my face, his thumb brushing softly along the corner of my lips. And in that moment, there was no going back. He pulled me in. I pulled him in. And finally, he kissed me. It was soft, but the energy behind it was undeniable. Slow yet electric, like a force pulling me under, consuming me completely. And for the first time, I didn't even think about stopping it. I should have, but I didn't. We hadn't even touched the clothes yet. I'd almost forgotten the pain in my leg. Tate was so close now, and I could see exactly what his hands were trying to do. We didn't want to wait. We couldn't wait. "Tate," I whispered, breathless. "You're very handsome, and I have to admit, I'm very attracted to you." He smiled, and something inside me tightened. "You're beautiful," he said, and at that moment, I felt something shift. Something big, undeniable. I looked at him, his shirt already unbuttoned, his body lean and strong and overwhelming. It excited me more than I could handle. "I hope the hotel's well insulated," he teased. I laughed, breathless. "You're going to need a lot of hotels with good insulation from now on." Tate grinned, and as our bodies moved closer, I knew there was no turning back. The line between us had already blurred beyond recognition. Afterward, as we lay there catching our breath, Tate looked at me, his eyes still dark with hunger. "Did you really just say that, Sai?" My vision was still blurry, my breathing unsteady. "I did," I whispered. He leaned back slightly, his breath warm against my skin. Every inch of my body still reacted to him. "I guess this Chicago business trip is going to last a little longer." he murmured, smirking. I froze, then started laughing. Looks like it. Tate tilted his head, that same knowing smile still on his lips. I have no complaints about that. We didn't look away from each other. We just kept smiling, because this was only the beginning, and nothing would ever be the same again.